You probably learned early that men are supposed to watch sports, not because anyone sat you down and explained it like a rule, but because the world treats it like one. Sports are everywhere, in conversation, in ads, in family gatherings, in office small talk, in the way certain men look at you when you don't know who's playing. And if you're a man who doesn't watch sports, you felt that moment where the room expects you to perform a shared language you don't speak. You either fake it, dodge it, or tell the truth and watch people quietly resort you in their mind. The eerie part is that not watching sports can make you feel like you're violating masculinity without doing anything wrong. You're not hurting anyone, you're just not interested. But your disinterest triggers something social as you stepped out of a ritual that's supposed to bind men together. And the first truth you should know is that your disinterest is not rare. Most people do not closely follow professional or college sports, and even in places where sports culture is loud, the majority still aren't super fans. So why does it still feel like you're the odd one out? Because sports aren't just entertainment. Psychologically, sports function like a portable tribe. They give people a ready made identity, a ready made conversation topic, a schedule, a set of heroes and villains, and a feeling of belonging that can be activated on demand. When people watch sports together, they aren't only watching athletes, they're syncing their emotions, sharing highs and lows, and borrowing a sense of meaning from the group. Research has found that watching sports events can enhance well being largely through social connections and emotional experiences, which is a fancy way of saying it can make people feel less alone in their own lives. Now imagine what it means psychologically to step away from that. If you don't watch sports, you're not just skipping a game, you're skipping a social glue that a lot of men are trained to rely on. And that's where the psychology splits into different reasons, different engines, different kinds of non sports men, because not watching can mean very different things depending on what it's protecting you from. For some men, it's not rebellion at all. It's simply that sports don't land emotionally. The brain doesn't attach to teams. The outcomes don't feel personal. The hype doesn't translate into meaning. People often assume that means you're boring, but it can mean the opposite, that your mind craves a different kind of stimulation. Some people are drawn to narrative and character, others to strategy and competition, others to music, comedy, art, documentaries, games, books, religion, politics, science, or building things. Sports are one emotional language. If it's not your language, it's not because you're broken, it's because your reward system hooks onto other signals. For other men, not watching sports is a form of self-protection from identity pressure. Sports culture can be beautiful, and it can also be a place where certain versions of masculinity get reinforced. Toughness, dominance, emotional stoicism, winning at any cost, humiliation as entertainment. There's research describing how sport-related identity can become tightly intertwined with masculinity and social status, and how certain jock identities can be linked to more rigid, sometimes harmful masculine norms. If you've ever felt like sports spaces make you shrink, like you have to perform a persona that isn't you, then not watching may be your nervous system choosing safety. It may be that you are refusing to walk into a room where you have to pretend to be someone else to belong. Sometimes the sports a man refuses aren't even the games, it's the social environment around them, the trash talk that turns mean, the alcohol-heavy hangouts that blur into behavior you don't respect, the culture of constant ranking and ridicule, the feeling that you're being measured by how much you care. If sports talk in your world feels like a test, then avoiding it can be a way of avoiding judgment, not because you're weak, but because your brain has learned that the cost of entry is too high. Another reason is that sports can represent time theft. If you're a man who grew up watching other people lose days of their life to a screen, emotionally shattered by outcomes they don't control, you might have developed an allergy to it. You might see fandom not as joy, but as unpaid emotional labor for billion-dollar industries. You might feel that sports ask for too much devotion to something that won't love you back. And that's not a crazy interpretation. Sports organizations benefit from strong fan identity, and fan identity is part of what keeps people engaged. If you're the kind of person who dislikes being emotionally engineered, you might resist sports for the same reason you resist other mass rituals. You don't like being pulled. And then there's the simple truth that some men don't watch sports because they don't enjoy what sports often provide: emotionally intense group experiences. They don't want the roar, the crowd, the tribalism, the emotional spikes. Their nervous system prefers calm, or they're already overwhelmed by life and don't want more adrenaline. Sports watching can be energizing, but it can also be draining if you're not built for collective intensity. When research talks about sports fandom supporting well being through social connection, it's also implying something else. For people who don't crave that connection in that form, the benefit doesn't land. Some men don't watch sports because sports represent a particular kind of social bonding they don't trust. Team identity can create community, but it can also create us versus them thinking. And some people don't like the way they feel when they're swept into that. They don't like feeling tribal. They don't like how quickly crowds can turn cruel. They don't like how easily loyalty becomes aggression. And if you're someone who has been targeted by group behavior before, you may be especially sensitive to anything that smells like mob energy. Sports can be a harmless outlet for tribal instincts, but if you've been hurt by tribal instincts, you may choose distance. Then there's the man who doesn't watch sports because he is lonely in a different way. This sounds backward because sports are often treated as the cure for male loneliness, and sometimes they are. Professional psychology discussions about sports fandom note that being a fan can support social connection and mental health for many people. But if you've never had the friend group, the family ritual, the we watch the game together tradition, then sports can become a reminder of what you don't have. Watching alone can feel emptier than not watching at all. Sitting in front of a screen while the world celebrates community can make the isolation louder, so you turn it off. Not because you hate sports, but because you hate what sports highlight in your life. Some men also don't watch sports because they never learned how. That sounds ridiculous until you remember how social this is. A lot of fandom is inherited. Someone explains the rules to you. Someone teaches you the teams. Someone makes it feel like belonging. Without that bridge, sports can feel like noise and an inside jokes you're not in on. And because masculinity often punishes ignorance, men will pretend they don't care, rather than admit they don't understand. So, I'm not into sports can sometimes mean I don't know how to enter and I'm not willing to be embarrassed. Another engine is moral discomfort. Some men don't watch because they see sports as a pipeline into certain values they reject: excessive commercialization, gambling saturation, violent spectacle, exploitation of bodies, or the way institutions handle scandals. Whether or not every critique is fair, the psychology is clear. You don't want to attach your emotions to a system you don't respect, so you refuse attachment entirely. That refusal can feel like integrity because it is, in a way. You're protecting your attention, which is one of the only resources you truly own. But let's be honest about the social cost. The reason not watching sports can feel like being psychologically different as a man is that sports are a default bonding script in many male spaces. When you remove that script, you have to replace it with something else, and a lot of men don't have a replacement. They were never taught how to bond without a shared external object. Sports are convenient because they provide a safe subject that avoids vulnerability. You can talk for hours without revealing anything tender about yourself. You can have closeness without intimacy. That's part of the appeal, and it's also part of the trap. So if you're a man who doesn't watch sports, you might have something a lot of men secretly lack. You can't hide behind that script. You have to build connections differently. You have to either talk about real life, accept distance, or find communities that bond over other things. And that can make you psychologically distinct, not because you're better, but because your life forces you to develop different social muscles. If you've ever felt judged for this, the judgment is rarely about the game. It's about what the game symbolizes. Sports can symbolize normal guy, safe guy, one of us. So when you don't watch, some people unconsciously treat it as a signal that you might not follow the other unspoken rules either, that you might be harder to categorize, and people fear what they can't categorize. They prefer men who fit in neat boxes. Sports fandom is one of those boxes. There's also a quieter, more personal reason some men don't watch sports. They don't like who they become when they do. Some men feel themselves get angrier, more volatile, more obsessive, more consumed. They don't like the way their mood becomes dependent on an outcome they don't control. They don't like feeling hijacked. They don't like the emotional hangover, so they stop. And in a culture that often tells men to suppress emotions, it's ironically more emotionally mature to notice what something does to you and choose accordingly. And yes, some men don't watch sports because they're simply uninterested in men's sports culture specifically, which has historically dominated public attention and created a certain vibe. Recent survey work shows people are more likely to follow men's professional sports than women's, which reflects how attention has been distributed culturally. If you don't resonate with that culture, you might not resonate with the product it's built around. So, what is the psychology behind men who don't watch sports? In the most honest sentence, it's usually one of three things. Your reward system doesn't attach to it, your nervous system doesn't feel safe in what it symbolizes, or your identity refuses to outsource belonging to a team you didn't choose for reasons you actually respect. And if you're watching this and you're that man, here's the question that cuts deeper than why don't you like sports? What do you use instead? Where do you put your need for belonging, for ritual, for shared emotion, for dopamine, for community, for meaning? Because sports aren't the only way to meet those needs, but they are a widely available way. And when you don't use them, you either build something else or you live without it. That's why not watching sports can sometimes feel lonely. Even if you're satisfied with your choice, you're stepping away from a shared language. And if you don't replace that language, you risk drifting into a world where you have fewer bridges to other men, fewer easy gatherings, fewer default conversations, fewer excuses to be around people without having to be vulnerable. Sports fandom can be a mask, but it can also be a doorway. If you refuse the doorway, you need another one. And here's the final eerie truth. In a world where so much male bonding is built around safe, external objects, a man who doesn't watch sports often has to decide whether he will become invisible or whether he will become intentional, whether he will isolate or whether he will build a community around something else, whether he will keep dodging the question or whether he will own his difference and stop apologizing for it. Because the real psychological story isn't that you don't watch sports. It's that you're living without one of the most socially accepted shortcuts to belonging, and you're either learning to build belonging the hard way or you're learning to live with the quiet ache of not having it.